Much of the modern understanding of Moloch comes from the biblical accounts of Leviticus, both books of Kings, and the book of Jeremiah, where Moloch is quite neatly established as a gruesome god of the Canaanites, who required the sacrifice of children. Throughout these accounts, God is seen to warn his people not to partake in such worship, and that this practice was so despicable it could even be punished by death. Moloch's sway over the Israelites proves to denote his influence, for though he might not have had the same reach as Baal, the more infamous pagan deity mentioned in the Bible, he was still able to corrupt the likes of even Solomon, who built temples for him. In fact, child sacrifice towards Moloch continued to happen as late as Josiah's time, and these sorts of rituals were pretty apparent, taking place at Topheth in the Valley of Gehenna. Attempts to stamp out Moloch are detailed quite explicitly, particularly in the case of Josiah, who, under the instruction of his god, set about to abolish the diabolical deity and his associated worship through the means of force. The Bible tells us, "And Josiah defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter to pass through the fire to Moloch." Whilst some speculate that this was the last of Moloch as far as the Bible is concerned, others suggest that Moloch worship either continued, as implied in the account by Jeremiah, or that the act of worshipping Moloch was such a heinous crime that it remained in the forefront of God's mind and became one of the first things he condemns the Israelites with in his speech to Jeremiah. The Bible tells us, "They set up their vile images in the house that bears my name, and defiled it. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind, that they should do such a detestable thing, and so make Judah sin." This is the sort of rhetoric put forth by the Bible, whose writers naturally sought to vilify Moloch, who was not only incongruent with the worship of their own god, but also required quite the monstrous contribution in the form of children. Yet Moloch wasn't always considered to be a rival deity of the biblical god, nor even a Canaanite deity by some interpretations. In fact, if we consult actual historical accounts, we find that Moloch is actually nowhere to be seen, but instead we are met by a deity or deities who sound like they have quite the ominous resemblance to him. If we were to travel back in time to Carthage, one of the most important trading hubs of the ancient Mediterranean, and perhaps one of the most affluent cities of the classical world, we might find the chief god being worshipped here was a deity named Baal Hammon. This deity was believed to be responsible for vegetation and crop growth, and as well as being known as a powerful weather and fertility god, also saw to the prosperity and productivity of the land. Considering how important the agricultural aspects of the community were to these ancient people in Carthage, you can see why Baal Hammon was especially worshipped. His very realm of influence was a matter of life and death for these people. Either they ate, or they didn't, and thus starved. You can then imagine how far these ancient people would be willing to go in order to secure a successful harvest, or to manifest the right weather conditions. The biblical account in chapter 18 of 1 Kings tells us that the Phoenicians would dance to the point of exhaustion for their god, and if he did not answer them, they would even lacerate themselves with swords and spears in order to earn his attention. Failing this, the most drastic offering they could make in order to appease their god was child sacrifice. Sound familiar? The likes of historian Diodorus Siculus would have us believe that in times of great strife or crisis, children would be offered up as a tribute to the deity, almost as if to illustrate how in dire need they were of his mercy. To make matters a little more confusing, however, the historians encountering the Phoenician and Punic religions for the first time, most of whom in this instance were Greek or Roman, did not report of them using the names of the local people, but would rather translate these foreign gods into the framework of their own mythology. For the Greeks and Romans then, Baal Hammon, who was understood to be a deity who accepted child sacrifice, would then naturally share a lot in common with a deity who actually ate children, Cronus or Saturn respectively. Therefore, in many of the accounts that we'll come to look at, Baal Hammon is not always mentioned specifically, but rather replaced with the use of Cronus or Saturn, whom the Greek and Roman audiences would naturally have more of an understanding of. In Greek mythology, Cronus, or Saturn in Roman mythology, was the former king of the lost golden age of the gods, but was more commonly remembered as a feared, abusive tyrant. Not only was he paranoid and territorial regarding his throne, but he feared usurpation by the younger generation, to the point that he was willing to even eat his own children the moment they were born. The Greeks may not have treated him purely as an evil figure, but his myth became increasingly negative over time, to the point that his conflation with this deity being worshipped by the Phoenicians became almost natural. One of the earliest writers associated with this tradition is Cleitarchus, a 4th century BC Greek historian of Alexander the Great, who tells us, "There stands in their midst a bronze statue of Cronus, its hands extended over a bronze brazier, the flames of which engulf the child. When the flames fall upon the body, the limbs contract, and the open mouth seems almost to be laughing until the contracted body slips quietly into the brazier. Thus it is that the grin is known as sardonic laughter, since they die laughing." This gruesome account is later corroborated in the Suda, a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia of the ancient Mediterranean world, where we are told, "And Cleitarchus and others say that in Carthage, during great prayers, they place a boy in the hands of Cronus. A bronze statue is set up with outstretched hands, and under it a baking oven, and then put fire under. The boy shrunk by the fire seems to laugh." It was this account by Cleitarchus that was believed to have been preserved by ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, who described another bronze statue with outstretched hands onto which children were placed, eventually falling into a fire below. In Book 13 of his Library of History, Siculus recounts a particular moment of strife for the Carthaginians, where after the death of Hannibal, the plague had broken out amongst the army, and many suffered and died. Hannibal's father, Himlacar, and the general of the army, decided that the best thing to do in this pressing time was to supplicate to the gods, most specifically to Cronus, who would require at least one child to be appeased. The account reads, "Among the dead there was also Hannibal the general, and among the watchguards who were sent out there were some who reported that in the night spirits of the dead were to be seen. Himlacar, on seeing how the throng was beset with superstitious fear, first of all put a stop to the destruction of the monuments, and then he supplicated the gods, after the custom of his people, by sacrificing a young boy to Cronus, and a multitude of cattle to Poseidon, by drowning them at sea." Cronus is spoken of more specifically in Book 20 of Siculus's Library of History, where he is seen to more explicitly preserve the tradition outlined by Cleitarchus. We are told, "The Carthaginians also alleged that Cronus had turned against them, inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god the noblest of their sons, but more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children, they had sent these to the sacrifice, and when an investigation was made, some of those who had been sacrificed were discovered to have been supposititious." Here we understand that the Carthaginians established a loophole in worshipping this Cronus, and instead of appeasing his appetite with their own children, rather bought and groomed other children so as to spare themselves of having to experience the loss. Naturally, this would have fundamentally trivialized the act of sacrificing, and would in some sense be like sacrificing the bones of an animal, but keeping the meat for oneself. This surely would have angered Cronus, whose due was withheld from him, and so when the Carthaginians once found themselves surrounded by enemies, They superstitiously believed that this was their punishment. Siculus continues, "When they had given thought to these things and saw their enemy encamped before their walls, they were filled with superstitious dread, for they believed they had neglected the honours of the gods that had been established by their fathers. In their zeal to make amends for their omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under superstition sacrificed themselves voluntarily, in number not less than 300. There was in their city a bronze image of Cronus, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire." Siculus's account is one of the most detailed ones we have from the ancient historians. Here we understand that the Carthaginians were attached to their own children, which is why they go through the effort of purchasing and grooming other children not related to them, so that these can serve the gods' consumption. The fact that they go to these lengths shows us that they too had their own reservation about child sacrifice, at least the sacrificing of their own children. But when they find themselves in a time of crisis, they're quick to rectify their behaviour and sacrifice more than they might have needed to. What's more, we see that some of them were so desperate to return to their God's good graces that they were even willing to sacrifice themselves. Later writers such as Plutarch repeat similar descriptions, once again treating the Carthaginian cult as one dedicated to the likes of Cronus or Saturn, and not the local Baal Hammon. While Siculus comes across as more neutral in his description, Plutarch does not hide his disdain for the practice, reflecting an attitude more familiar with the one we might have today. We are told in his On Superstition, "Would it not then have been far better for those Gauls and Scythians to have had absolutely no conception, no vision, no tradition regarding the gods, than to believe in the existence of gods who take delight in the blood of human sacrifice, and hold this to be the most perfect offering and holy rite? Again, would it not have been far better for the Carthaginians to have taken Critias or Diodorus, to draw up their law code at the very beginning, and so not to believe in any divine power or god, rather than to offer such sacrifices as they used to offer to Cronus? These were not in the manner that Empedocles described in his attack on those who sacrifice living creatures. Changed in form is the son beloved of his father so pious, who on the altar lays him and slays him. What folly!" Here we see Plutarch express his animosity, comparing the Carthaginians to the likes of the Gauls and the Scythians, a people who would have been the traditional enemies of Rome and considered undesirable, or even savage by his own Roman perspective. He claims it would have been better for the Carthaginians to not have had a god at all, and for them to have let the Athenian politician Critias make the rules, although perhaps someone even less qualified in the ancient Greek boxer Diodorus of Rhodes would have sufficed. Anything, according to Plutarch, would have been better than serving this child-devouring Cronus. He continues more of his disdain for the practice. "No, built with full knowledge and understanding, they themselves offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people, and cut their throats, as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile the mother stood by without tear or moan, but should she utter a single moan, or let fall a single tear, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nevertheless. And the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes, and drums took the cries of wailing, so it would not reach the ears of the people." By the mid-1st century, the trauma of this Cronus or Saturn figure had not been forgotten. Roman historian Quintus Curtus also lent his displeasure to the discourse, telling us some also advocated the revival of a religious rite which had been discontinued for many generations, and which I certainly would have not thought to be at all acceptable to the gods, namely the sacrifice of a freeborn male child to Saturn. Such sacrilege, to use a more appropriate word than sacrifice, the Carthaginians inherited from their founders, and they are said to have continued the practice right down to the time of their city's destruction. Had it not been vetoed by the elders, whose judgment carried weight in all matters, cruel superstition would have triumphed over civilized behavior. The horror of this deity echoed even 100 years after this into the 2nd century, where Roman writer Justin, in an effort to craft an abridgment of an earlier historian Pompeius Trogus' work, found himself addressing the Carthaginians. The city was founded 72 years before Rome, and while the bravery of its inhabitants made it famous in war, it was internally disturbed with various troubles arising from civil differences. Being afflicted, among other calamities, with a pestilence, they adopted a cruel religious ceremony, an execrable abomination, as a remedy for it, for they immolated human beings as victims, and brought children, whose age excites pity even in enemies, to the altars, entreating favour of the gods by shedding the blood of those whose life the gods are generally wont to be entreated. By the end of the century, even early Christian writers such as Tertullian could not stay his hand from writing about this deity, although perhaps in this example he does so as a means to counter the anti-Christian rhetoric that was prominent at that time. We see that he points out the hypocrisy of pagans who accuse Christians of crimes whilst ignoring their own religion's atrocities. One accusation commonly thrown at Christians in the Roman world was that they practiced ritual infanticide, a slander related to the misinterpretations about the Eucharist. Tertullian responds by basically telling them that no one in his community actually has ever eaten children, but people in Carthage and those of the Phoenician religion could not have said the same. In his Apologeticum, he notes, "Children were openly sacrificed in Africa to Saturn, as lately as the preconsulship of Tiberius, who exposed to public gaze the priests suspended on the sacred trees overshadowing their temple. So many crosses on which the punishment which justice craved overtook their crimes, as the soldiers of our country still can testify, who did that very work for the preconsul. And even now, that sacred crime still continues to be done in secret. It is not only Christians, you see, who despise you, for all that you do there is neither any crime thoroughly and abidingly eradicated, nor does any of your gods reform his ways. When Saturn did not spare his own children, he was not likely to spare the children of others, whom indeed the very parents themselves were in the habit of offering, gladly responding to the call which was made on them, and keeping the little ones pleased on the occasion, that they might not die in tears." Here Tertullian further emphasizes how much this practice was detested, not just by the Christians, but by the Romans too. For during the reign of Tiberius, priests of this Saturn were actually hung from sacred trees near the temple by Roman soldiers, which according to Tertullian was a fitting justice for their involvement in this sort of ritual. What's more, Tertullian provides us with details on the more disturbing aspects of Carthage that are presented in the accounts by Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch. How the parents were expected to show no grief and how the children were calmed or distracted. Antiquarian writer Philobibulus spoke of the specific names that the Phoenicians would use to address their god, and as to be expected, as a Greek writer, he refers to their deity not as Baal Hammon, but again as Cronus. However, he also appears to address this figure as Elis, which might correspond to the Semitic god El, a father of the gods and a supreme deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. In this version of events, Philo appears to focus on the actual mythology of the people, noting that this Elis had a son named Ledard, whom he would sacrifice when great dangers from war had beset the country. He tells us, "It was a custom of the ancients in great crisis of danger for the rulers of a city or nation in order to avert the common ruin, to give up the most beloved of their children for sacrifice as a ransom to the avenging demons, and those who were thus given up were sacrificed with mystic rites. Cronus then, whom the Phoenicians call Elis, who was king of the country, was deified as the star Saturn, had by a nymph of the country named Anabret an only begotten son, whom they on this account called Ledard, the only begotten being still so called among the Phoenicians. And when very great dangers from war had beset the country, he arrayed his son in royal apparel, and prepared an altar, and sacrificed him. By the 3rd century, the horror of this Carthaginian legend was still being talked about. Christian historian Eusebius, in his work Preparation of the Gospel, quoted several times from Neoplatonist philosopher Porphyry, a staunch critic of Christianity. Here we are told the Phoenicians too, in their great calamities of war or pestilence or drought, used to dedicate one of their dearest friends and sacrifice him to Cronus, and of those who thus sacrificed, the Phoenician history is full. Here we are told a somewhat unique account, where it wasn't just children being sacrificed to this Cronus, but actually one's dearest friends. It's implied here that this was fairly common too, with the Phoenician history being full of it. By the 4th to 5th centuries, the legend of Cronus, or Saturn, had not lost its luster. Philosopher and theologian Augustine of Hippo further confirmed this idea that it wasn't just children being put to the fires in Carthage, where he wrote in his work City of God, boys were wont to be immolated to Saturn by certain peoples, the Carthaginians for instance, and also that adults were immolated by some nations, for example the Gauls, because of all seeds, the human race is the best. 5th century Roman priest and historian Orosius took a slightly different approach when presenting his notions of the Carthaginians. Despite recognizing the dreadfulness entailed with the sacrifices, he also frames them in a sympathetic light, noting that they were constantly riddled with misfortune and were so utterly devastated by the incidents out of their hands that even the enemy may have pitied them. He tells us, the Carthaginians have always had domestic and internal misfortunes. Because of this source of discord and its unhappy faculty of causing disturbance, they have never yet enjoyed prosperity abroad or peace at home. When they were suffering from plagues in addition to their other misfortunes, they resorted to homicides instead of medicines. Indeed, they sacrificed human beings as victims and offered young children at their altars. In this way, they aroused even the pity of the enemy. As we've discussed, the chief god worshipped in the Punic population was Baal Hammon, a major deity associated with fertility and agriculture. When Greek writers encountered the religion of Carthage, they interpreted this foreign god through their own mythology, and portrayed this deity as Cronus. However, this wasn't the last evolution of this deity, however, for by the time of the Hebrew Bible, Moloch entered the scene. When Jewish and later Christian writers encountered Greek accounts of child sacrifice to Cronus in Carthage, the similarity to the biblical Moloch seemed striking. As a result, the Carthaginian practice described by Greek historians began to be interpreted as the same practice condemned in the Hebrew scriptures. Medieval Jewish commentators helped solidify this association, the most influential example being 12th century Rabbi Rashi, who wrote, "Top-het is Moloch, which was made of brass, and they heated him from his lower parts, and his hands being stretched out and made hot, they put the child between his hands, and it was burnt. When it vehemently cried out, the priests beat a drum, that the father might not hear the voice of his son, and his heart might not be moved." This description closely resembles the Greek account of the Carthaginian statue of Cronus. Rashi himself does not explicitly identify Moloch with Baal Hammon or Cronus, but the imagery he presents mirrors the classical description so closely that later readers assume the traditions may have referred to the same practice. According to biblical notes by Professor George F. Moore, the Moloch idol actually stood in the innermost of 7 chambers or cells that were separated by grated doors. Those who offered birds were permitted to enter the first or outer cell. Those who offered a goat could enter the second, a sheep to the third, a calf to the fourth, a young steer to the fifth, a bull to the sixth, and finally he who brought his son as an offering could enter the 7th chamber and be in the presence of the deity. Moore's description builds upon the imagery described by the ancient historians, telling us the idol itself had the head of a calf upon a human body. Its arms were extended, with the hands open, like those of a man who is about to receive something from another. The image was hollow, we must suppose of metal, and was heated by a fire from within till the hands were glowing. The priest took the child from its father and laid it in the hands of Moloch, where it was burned to death. The priests, meanwhile, violently began beating drums, that the cries of the victim might not be heard by the father and move his heart. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.